Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here for our Tuesday talk. I'm Brenda, your host, and with me today we have a special guest, Dr. Dinah Dye. I'm so excited to have her here, and we are joined with an amazing group of women. Hello, everyone. Blessings to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and we only have an hour. Let's get started here. Dr. Dye, it's so nice to meet you. I would like to tell everybody just a little bit about you for those that may not be aware of you or have had an opportunity to meet you. I have one of your books here. This is a good one. So Dr. Dye was raised in Ottawa, Canada, in a conservative Jewish home. And after recognizing the importance of connecting the Gospels with the epistles to their proper foundation in the Torah, which is the first 5 books, Dr. Dye established the ministry Foundations in Torah. I love that. So that is her website, and I would just really encourage everyone to zip over there, foundationsintorah.com. And she has amazing teaching there that's available. It's a membership, but she has a lot of information there that is just free to the public. And I have really enjoyed being on that. Dr. Dye holds a doctorate in Hebraic studies and in Hebraic studies and Christianity, and has been uncovering the Hebraic connections for over 40 years. Her teachings, she has 3 books out. Is that correct, Dr. Dye? You have 3 books out right now?
Two
You have
plus
2.
the work. I've got several workbooks, but 2 books.
2 books out. And The Temple Revealed in the Garden, that is one that I just finished. Fantastic. The Temple Revealed in the Garden. And is that right? The Temple
Yeah.
Revealed in the Garden. Yes. And then The Temple Revealed in Creation. And the Temple Revealed in Creation, uh, that's the one that is talking about kings, correct?
No, the garden one
The
is
garden one is talking about the
yeah.
kings. Okay, so I just finished the creation because it's talking about the family.
Yes. So yeah, the focus on the creation story is the family. And then the focus of the garden story is on kings and priests.
And I love that. So there are so many questions. I have a whole list. This is terrible. I have this whole list of questions. It's like, let's not do that. let's just talk about a little bit about how you perceive the garden, um, and or creation. Which would you prefer to talk about this morning?
Well, I think we should probably talk about the garden. The
Because it's
creation, it's a little esoteric sometimes. It's
okay.
hard to wrap your head around that kind of dimension. So the garden is a little easier to absorb, but it is in essence a miniature of the creation. So I'm going to say about 10 years ago, I just what happens with us in our faith and in our Bible studies, we tend to get very narrowly focused into the minutia of things. And I realized we sometimes we just have to step back to see the big picture.
Yes.
That's what when I understood that, I began to see the whole structure of the Bible as a temple. And I was reading a lot of different scholars. There's some fabulous scholars out there now, and really helped
Yes.
rearrange my thinking. So one of the things I would like to tell the ladies is that it's okay to think differently about stuff. It's okay to ask a lot of questions, and no one is going to have all the answers. But the problem where we've landed is that we have these boxes. And so if you're not in box A or B, then somehow what you have to say or think doesn't count. And
Hmm.
it's difficult. You go into a congregation, the pastor is up on the pulpit, he shares the message, and that's kind of the end of the story. And you're going, okay. And if you ask questions that are kind of outside the box, no one wants to hear them. So my goal is to say it's okay. You can think differently, because what's happened now is our young people, they're asking questions and we're not giving them good answers. In fact, we're not giving them answers at all. So for example, one of the main questions that a young person would ask, and I've been in a couple of classes, is, well, if Adam and Eve were the only two people, like, what about other people? Like, how are there other people on the planet, and where did they come from, and all? And those are reasonable questions, but we don't give them good answers. We just say, well, this is the way it is, and that's too bad. So my goal in the work and research I do is to look at those kinds of questions and say, okay, and that causes you to think differently. And people are challenged by that. And I've been called everything you can imagine. But I think we need to go back and revisit
Hmm.
and try to unpack. Uh, See, we don't appreciate the ancient world and how it was structured. And so what we end up doing is inserting our modern understanding into the ancient world, and then we're kind of neither here nor there.
I think
So
that's a very, very good point. We look at it from where we are and our society and how we perceive things right now. It doesn't fit, Dr. Dye.
it
And
does
that's
not fit.
no.
So the key would be to go back and look at the context, figure out what the ancient world is saying about this, how they approached it, and then we can move forward and say, okay, well, we don't live in the ancient world, and personally, I don't want to live in the ancient world.
Yeah.
And so now, how can I make that? How can I make that connection? How can I have an application for today? And that's okay. We should do that. Everything I have my structure that I use, and I've actually been going out to teach this. It's called Roadmap to Living. And so how are we going to, because I think what's going on in our culture and around us now is taking over our thinking. So we have to have answers. So I talk about historical patterns, looking at the historical patterns about applying the biblical principles and evaluating godly wisdom. Those are kind of your three areas. And so everything I do has that in mind. So the ancient world is very important, but it makes virtually no sense to us. And we spend no time evaluating it. And we are forced in that area to look at what scholars have written, because I mean, off the cuff, who knows anything about it? So that's really, I have written in that way, going back to the ancient world and saying, okay, what on earth are they saying? And sometimes, you don't even get an answer. But I'm trying to think of a simple example. Just for example, let's just use the term the Son of God.
That's a
So
good one.
yeah, it's as basic as it gets. We see the theme through the New Testament. We see Yeshua called the Son of God, and then we'll end up in an argument over that because we don't even know what we're talking about. So, is he human? Is he divine? Is he deity? Is he, what is the Son of God? Well, if you were to go back into the ancient world, you would find out that every king who passed on the throne and the inheritance to his son, the son was called the Son of God. That would be true of Caesar, and just pick your king in the ancient world. So every son raised up to take the throne was called the Son of God.
Mm,
See what I mean? So now when you're reading in
yes.
the New Testament that he's the Son of God, is he the Son of God or is he not the Son of God? We're arguing. Basically, he's the Son of Yahweh raised up to take the throne and rule and reign over the earth. It's pretty simple, but yet we get into arguments over it because we don't understand the term.
And also we try to take everything so literally, and there's the Torah is filled, the Bible is filled with idioms, and
Yeah.
we pull those words out, and we define those words individually, and basically we're coming up with a new religion because that's not what's happening.
Well, one of the
So
problems too is the ancient world doesn't describe things the way we describe things. So when we look at a tree, in our mind, I'm going to describe the bark, whether it's soft or it's, rough. How tall is it? What color the leaves are? What's the shape? What kind of tree it is? But the ancient world looks at the function of the tree. What is its purpose? And so for the ancients, the tree was basically the largest living thing on planet Earth. So it began to compare a tree with a king, because the king was sovereign and had a sovereign rule over the empire. And so the tree and the king became synonymous. So that kind of changes a lot of things when you go back through scripture. So there we could go through multiple things and show, the ancient world saw it in sort of a more metaphorical way, although I hate using that word.
yeah,
Because, well, is it literal? Is it more metaphorical? Well, the backdrop is
yes.
historical and it's accurate and it's literal. However, the overlay is
Yeah.
this language that's very different from ours. So typically when I think in like Daniel chapter 2, when you see this description of King Nebuchadnezzar, and he's described and compared to a tree with this great canopy, and the idea of this the shade the canopy produces is speaking of his sovereignty over the empire. So we have to try to learn to think differently. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to think of the ancient world. They looked at the purpose and function of stuff. And we want to describe it in literal terms, but they are going to look at what is its purpose.
I love that. I actually have that written down, form versus function, because
Yeah,
we really focus on the form of things,
correct.
and we're not it's really, how does that work? How does it And we do that with everything. We do that with our interpretation of the word. We do that with people. We do that with, everything we study, and then all of a sudden it just gets us off base. And then everything is contradictory.
Right.
And I don't believe that the word of God is contradictory in the sense of what he is saying, who he is, who the
Right.
character of God is. He
Right.
doesn't contradict himself, but we do when we're trying to apply all of these out of order rules.
Yeah. Well, and it gets us stuck even in the very first chapter of Genesis, because we
Yeah,
go through that chapter specifically we're focused on material origins, which isn't to
right.
say that it isn't. However, there's something underlying there.
Mhm.
So if we can look at what is the purpose of creation, well, and we can maybe talk about this a little bit, but
Sure.
the very first verse of Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth,
Yes.
esoteric sounding, but it's actually a statement of covenant. It's almost like a preamble to a covenant. And God is making a statement about two entities, two spheres that are going to join together in unity. And the creation week tells us as they join together in unity and to become one, they're going to produce life. So that's a principle all through the Bible. When two join together, or when you cut a covenant, two join together, and the purpose of them joining together was to produce something. So life comes forth. And, when you start looking at it in those terms, instead of material origins and what something is made of, and, what minerals are here, and how much oxygen and carbon dioxide are we talking about? It's not speaking about that. They
Right.
didn't, it's not that this isn't their world. They could care less about, how much zinc is in something. They're looking at their world, yeah, with different eyes. Now, remember, their world is very different from ours because their world is run by the gods, you know,
Right. Right.
and that's a whole nother topic, which we might not be able to get into. But I would say the most important thing to understand is that the basis of the Bible has to do with a covenant, and the covenant that is established between God and his people, between God and his subject, and also between the king and his son. That is a very important covenant. Every king established with his son, in order to, it would be called a royal grant covenant, in order to pass on the inheritance. And the inheritance of the king to the son was his empire. And when the
Wow.
king made a covenant with his subjects, basically he was promising to take care of them, to provide for them. So, like, one of the in the ancient world, the most difficult thing was to grow food and feed people. And we go to ancient Mesopotamia. Once they figured out how to store food, in large quantities, wheat being the predominant food, everything changed. So the king was basically, as he was making a covenant with his subjects, he was promising to provide them food, to grow food in the empire so that all the people were fed. And this is why we have so much language in the Bible about growing stuff and agriculture and feeding. We see Yeshua feeding people. This is
Right.
all very much ancient Near East language and the responsibility of the king when he made his covenant.
Oh, oh, that just hit me. So when Yeshua was feeding the thousands, it was
Right.
part of what, I mean, there was multiple layers, but part of
Correct.
what that was saying was, I am your king and I
Yes.
will provide for you.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the
Oh,
message today. So many of his parables have to do with agriculture. We see a lot with the fig tree and the grapevine and all these, and that's because kings were responsible for that portion. So I would mention whenever a king, let's say he built his temple, which was supposed to house his throne, and then of course there'd be a palace, and that came later. There is a progression and evolution of how this all comes about. So just a heads up, whenever you're
Sure.
looking at a period in the Bible, what went on in 3000 BCE is not how it functioned in 1200 BCE. You understand that? Or in, first century. So you have to be cognizant of where you are in history. But one of the most important things that the king did in his complex was to build or make a garden. All kings did that. Kings were considered, one of their vocations was as a horticulturalist. So, for example, when a king would go off and fight a battle against another empire, one of the first things they'd do was to conquer the temple palace complex with the garden. And they would literally take back saplings and cuttings and things like that from the other king's garden and plant it in theirs. And that was a message of conquering, because the greater the garden, the greater the power that this king had. So many of you will remember, we have in the one of the wonders of the ancient world is King Nebuchadnezzar's garden, right? The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, although we think it was actually Sennacherib, but that's another story. So the Hanging Gardens, which he had made for his bride, his wife. So gardens were everything in the ancient world for the king. So I mentioned, and you were all familiar with when Yeshua, when the Marys went to the tomb, right? And they see this guy and they go, oh, I guess he's the gardener, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, he may well have been a gardener, and that's fine, but that was a statement of kingship, that their king had returned and he was going
Mm.
to take the throne and resume the duties and responsibilities of the king over his empire, over his subjects.
I love it's just this tiny little moment, but it's speaking volumes. This
Yeah.
tiny little moment of her thinking that that was the gardener. And then,
Yeah. Yeah,
it's just
you read it, it's kind of random, like, okay. Where's
yeah,
that in there?
that
So
was
those are the
important
kinds of
because
questions. Yeah, yeah, you got to ask yourself, well, okay, we're in a garden. Why are we in a garden? Yeah, it could be the garden tomb, and that's a whole nother story. But I always ask myself the question behind the statement, because what we find with the writers, and you all know this, I mean, they don't tell you everything. They'll give you a bit of the history, but man, there's a lot of gaps in there. And they allow you to fill in the gaps. I suppose sometimes what isn't said is almost more as important as what is said. But
mm,
the statements they're making, the information they're giving you is for a purpose. And they want you to look at that information and interpret that information that they're giving you. And so you ask yourself the question is, well, why'd they put that in there? That, and so then I go on a journey looking for the answers to why that information is in there. And you can, that's true of just about every story we have in the Bible.
mhm. That's very true. It's interesting because I look back on my and I'm speaking. Hope I'm speaking for a lot of people. I'll just throw myself under the bus here. Um, I remember when I first started Bible college, we weren't allowed to question
Right.
allowed to question the professors. I mean, honestly, like if it just didn't you didn't do it. It
No,
didn't
you
happen.
didn't.
If it didn't make sense to you, that was because you weren't smart enough
Right.
to
Right.
understand. And I had so many questions, and you brought one of them up, and it's like, who did Adam and Eve's children marry? I mean, I'm just like, that was one of my big questions, but nobody ever had an answer.
Well,
And
and
when
it's
I
a
asked
fair
that question, I
question.
got in trouble.
Yeah. Well, we could talk about that just for a second. So if
Sure.
if you understand who the Bible was, what's the story? Okay. So the story, and in my creation book, I go into a lot more detail of, because the cosmos in essence is building a temple. What's the point? What is the purpose of that? The cosmos is synonymous with the temple, with creation. It's building a place for the presence of God. So essentially building a temple for God, the entirety of the
Beautiful.
universe. Yeah. So
Beautiful.
he always wants a place for his presence. And so, all through the Bible, we see them building a temple for his presence and then it being destroyed because of their disobedience and then rebuilding it and then it being destroyed. I kind of call it Groundhog Day. So the message is you go through, there's not anywhere where you don't see this emphasis, this push to build a place for the presence of God. So of course, when they come out of Egypt and they pass through the sea, what's the thing they do? They rebuild. In essence, building the tabernacle was rebuilding the cosmos, if you will. I'm going to be bringing this out in my third book, is the temple revealed in Noah's Ark, chaos to order. But the story of Noah really is the story of building a house for the presence of God, a temple. So even though we can argue about the boat stuff and the measurements, and I just would add, at the time, probably we're looking at maybe 3000 BCE, the biggest boat on Euphrates or Tigris was 10 feet. So here Noah's just built an aircraft carrier, right? And you got to say, okay, anyone reading that at the time is going, okay, well, what does this mean? So a lot of scholars have suggested that in essence, what Noah was doing, he was rebuilding the cosmos. The picture of the boat he was building was a recreation event and a reinstituting of the cosmos, if you will. There's a whole nother story. But just the idea that we are always dealing with temple building in the scripture, house building, and we can equate it with dynasty building, because building a house or a temple or dynasty are kind of one and the same. Why? So the king can be seated on the throne. Because if you don't have a temple, the king can't be seated on the throne. If you don't have your king on the throne, then your world is in chaos, because it was the king enthroned, crowned, his coronation, that brought order to the sphere in which it was. So we go back to Genesis. God has created the universe, which is this picture of a cosmic temple, so that he can be seated on the throne. So the story of the Bible is making a temple and putting the king on the throne. So now when we go back and we see the line of Adam to second Adam, there are myriads of other people. The Bible doesn't choose to go into the line of every single human on planet Earth.
Right.
The Bible has chosen this line, the son of Adam. We can argue whether it's a guy or a humanity, whatever, for another day. But chapter 5 in Genesis gives you the line of the kings. From Adam, you go through 10 to Noah. And then coming out of there, we've got 3 sons, and they separate and rule the known world. And out of Shem, right? Yeah, comes Abraham. And Abraham functions as a king, okay? Though he's called out of Ur, he's going to the land, and out of his line comes, Isaac, Jacob, and on down through, David and into Yeshua the Messiah. So if you will think of the Bible as the genealogy of the line of the kings to take the throne, to rule and reign over this earth, then you can say that's the focus, and that doesn't mean there isn't anybody else. So the garden is the focus, but that doesn't mean there's no one living and existing outside the garden. The garden is the place for the king. And of course, his throne would be part of that to rule and reign over. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but it is so foreign to what we have been taught.
Yeah.
And I think one of my favorite things about you personally is that you challenge my thinking, and I ponder it all day long. I'll be walking around going, really, I didn't even know. I watched one of your videos and you were talking about the rapture. Okay, blew my mind. I was like, I didn't even know I believed that. I mean, I didn't even know that stuff was still inside of me. I thought I'd been delivered, but obviously I hadn't. But
we're all victims of that.
Seriously, and we have to, I have to have grace for myself, or I'd be walking around with one of those little things, just beating myself constantly. But one of the things, 2 things. Number one, growing up the way that I did, and where a lot of us did come from, structured Christianity, we weren't allowed to question anything, and the only thing that ever occurred was exactly what was written, and there was nothing else. So the idea that there were other people that we just weren't told about, that's kind of cuckoo. I mean, that's like, oh, I have to rethink that. And then And then the other point that I wanted to make, and maybe you can elaborate, maybe you can help some of us who don't have this background a little bit. In our society in 2021 right now, we really in the Western world, we really don't understand monarchy. We really do
Right.
not understand kingship. We really don't. And I'm going to put my hand up there and say I really don't understand that. Could you maybe give us a little information, a little background about uh, what is the value of having a king versus what we're used to? Um, let's not even get into that, what we're
Well,
used
you
to.
can't, so you can't have an ordered society without a ruler, I mean, that's
Right,
what God has established in the beginning. And I would
right.
have to say understanding kingship for the modern world is close to impossible.
Yeah.
I grew up in Canada, so we had the Queen. And so she was very much, and especially back in the day, not so much now, but we, recognized her birthdays and, all these different important points in the Queen's life, the coronation. I mean, I was just little, but man, that was like the biggest thing on planet
Biggest thing.
Earth. So there was a certain amount of what I would call allegiance to the Queen, even though we had prime minister and governor generals, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the one thing that obviously, when the pilgrims came, they came to escape that tyranny, because kingship will descend virtually every time into tyranny. The king is supposed to exercise justice and righteousness, but so for example, in Israel's economy, when Israel broke covenant with God,
Mhm.
uh, then they were, punished, disciplined, and sent into exile. And the thing about exile is, when the Babylonians came, not only they destroyed the city of Jerusalem, they destroyed the temple, they they destroyed the monarchy, the glue that held the nation together, the institution that held the glue together. So whenever kingship that's its responsibility, is to reign sovereignly over its people, exercising justice and righteousness, and holding the nation together. So when you see Moses going up on the mountain into the cloud in Numbers 24, receiving the uh, tablets of testimony, that in the ancient world they call them the tablets of destiny, but essentially those were the governing documents for the nation. And so, now Moses is given the governing documents, and now he has to rule because he's a king. He's a
Mhm.
king priest figure. Now he has to rule over the nation. And you see how they, structurally divide that up so that there's elders and all to help him. But I think the most difficult part of all of it is the idea of worship. Like we don't, if we go into the garden, we see the language of worship comes in cultivation and guarding to protect the sacred space and work the ground. Again, the king is responsible to do that. And so our idea of worship is kind of warped, right? I mean, we're like,
Right.
we'll just bow down and, but worship really, it's not so much that as it is allegiance. So one of the covenant aspects that we are familiar with, faith, for example,
Mhm.
faith is kind of nebulous to us today. It's very abstract, isn't it? It's like,
Yes, it
okay,
is.
yeah, faith. Oh,
Yes.
I think I just need, I just need to conjure up enough faith.
Right. And it's a
But for the
feeling,
Yeah,
supposedly. It's more of a feeling. It's which is
exactly. All the
which is not.
attributes that we see are just feelings, really,
Yeah.
emotion. Okay,
Yeah.
okay, I feel faith today. Tomorrow, not so much. So for the ancients, those terms, for example, the fruit of the Holy Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kind, all that, it is very esoteric in some ways, very subjective. But for them, those were covenant obligations. And so a covenant obligation
Mm,
is
I love that.
objective and it is concrete. So faith in the New Testament, and not every time, but multiple places, faith should better be translated allegiance. So if you can think of your faith in God as your allegiance to him, and the best with God is, the allegiance that we have to our country, to the flag, to the Constitution. I mean, we don't really have a whole lot, to understand allegiance and what those things mean. But if we can think of it in those terms instead of, this whole bow down thing, like, you got some weird pagan god and you're bowing down and worshiping. But you're giving honor and allegiance to your king, and you're serving him in that capacity. And I mean, there's just multiple layers in terms of allegiance, but you don't ever give your allegiance to anyone else. It's to him
Right.
and him only. So
Right.
um I don't have necessarily a great answer, because understanding kingship, I think it's a lifetime thing. I don't, I'm still growing in my understanding of it. I don't have it all figured out, but I do understand that, he needs to be seated on the throne of my heart, and nothing else. Does that mean I'm going to
Right.
screw up? Yeah, I do. But
Mhm.
he's provided the mechanism to restore the covenant, to
Mhm.
daily restore a covenant that he's made with us.
Mhm.
As far as repentance and forgiveness and restitution, those are the things that will bring the covenant back together. And we can talk a
Mhm.
little bit more about covenant too, if you like.
That's that's great. I love that you said covenant obligation because it's concrete.
Yes.
And so we have a tendency to think of things like you were saying, uh, it's more ethereal. It's like kind of like thought. It's just thoughts, right?
Yes, yes,
But how he has outlined things for us is very, very concrete. This is who I am. This is how I'm going to care for you. I This is who I am. This is what I'm going to do for you. He outlined it very beautifully in the ketubah,
yeah,
basically
yeah,
for
and
us,
that's the
right?
covenant.
And that is,
Yeah,
and so that's where we can have this assurance, where we can begin uh, having our feet on solid ground. It's not if we do good enough.
right.
It is because he said so.
Well,
And
because we're in covenant, we're motivated to, and that would
yes,
be an example of
yeah,
allegiance, by doing good
yes,
to those that
yeah,
are poor and the downtrodden and those with no
yeah,
voice, because
that's
we're
right.
acting as kings on his behalf in the world.
That's right. If we are little mini kings, if we are mini priests, right? That's we're supposed to be the shadows of Messiah and do as he
Exactly.
did,
Exactly. Yeah, we've got to
then
rethink it.
then we have to rethink it, right? And it's I don't think it, I mean, let's look at it this way. Would Yeshua had ever sat and thought, well, I wonder if I did good enough for God to be pleased with me? No, he wouldn't be saying that.
Well, his perfection was in that he didn't break the covenant.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's not
And
behavioral, so to
no.
speak. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, right.
So everything. I think, let's go back to the beginning, so we have a little better framework. And I'm probably going to
Sure.
say a few things that
You're gonna
you
blow
don't
our
have to
minds.
agree. It's okay.
Yeah. Okay,
So
that's
if
good.
our first verse, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Yes.
And then we go down into Genesis, I believe it's 2:4, and it'll say these are the toldot of the heavens and the earth. Now, the Hebrew word there for toldot is usually translated, these are the history of the heavens and the earth, these are the accounts of the heavens
Mhm.
and the earth, something along those lines. It has more to do with genealogy, and it really means, toldot really means to bring forth, to bear children. So then you say to yourself, what on earth does that mean? These are the children that are born from the heavens and the earth. Like, that makes no sense.
Mm,
Okay. So now we go back to Genesis 1:1. Again, so in our minds, heaven is sort of this ethereal place way up in the sky.
right,
we kind
right.
of get the earth thing, but it's speaking of making a covenant between the two. And the rest of the creation week is all about covenant making. In comparison to, the best comparison we have on purpose is to marriage. So that when you cut a covenant, you cut two things in order to bind them together, so that a man and a woman can come together and produce life. And this is our same concept for the creation. And I had mentioned to you when we chatted, if you go down through all of the various elements of creation, so heaven and earth, heaven is male, earth is feminine.
I
um,
love that.
and then,
Yes.
light and dark, same thing. Darkness is feminine, light is masculine. day and night, light and dark, waters above and waters below. The waters above were said to be the male waters, the waters below were the female waters. And then you get to, Adam and Eve, and she is cut from him, right? In order for the
Yes.
two to join together and to produce life. So this whole thing is all covenant language. So let's go back to, what does it mean when they mean heaven, and what does it mean when they mean earth? Like, how does heaven and earth join together, right? Because their unity is going to produce life. So instead of the covenant, the creation week, talking about a person, they understood domains. So
Mm.
the domain of heaven was the domain of the king. So in the ancient world, even though like they would make those ziggurat things, right, out in the desert, look like mountains, because mountains represented government, and when the god would make his temple on top of the mountain, but the place the king would sit on the throne was on top of the mountain. And because the mountain's so big, in looking at them, the mountain goes up into heaven. So when a king ascended the throne, he was basically, you remember Solomon went down to the Gihon and then he ascended. So he ascended the mountain to go and sit on the throne. So when the king sat on the throne, it was as though he was in heaven. So to ascend a mountain and enter a temple meant ascending into heaven. You understand that? It wasn't
Mm.
literally going up into outer space, 7 million miles. It was that the king was ascending to sit on the throne, and now it was as though he were in heaven. His subjects are on earth. And the priests in a complex, a temple complex, would mediate between the two spheres, between heaven and earth. And so he would enter into the temple, go before the king, for example, to the oracle of the god up on the mountain in quote heaven, receive his instructions, and then he would descend and take that to the people. Exactly what we see Moses doing.
Mhm.
So what it is, more than it is the idea, it's the unity of the two spheres, but it's the unity of the two that's represented, the king and his subjects making a covenant between heaven and earth. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so now this language is all over the place. So this covenant is being made between the king, between Yahweh and his people. And so when you are in the covenant, you are provided with covenant protections. And there's a lot of things about a covenant, but you would take on the name of the other person. So God becomes, the God of Israel, and Israel becomes the children of God. Those are identities.
Oh.
And when you enter into a covenant with your king, you were given a name and an identity. So we see, for example, whenever you see naming in scripture, it's
Mhm.
giving something existence or identity. When you remove the name, the greatest tragedy and shame in the ancient world was to remove identity and name. So when you think about the children of Israel going into exile, right? And
Mhm.
particular when the northern tribe is taken by the Assyrians, they lose their identity. Like, you can't tell them, they're in all parts of the empire, you can't tell them apart from anyone else. They lose their identity. Now, in order to maintain their identity as a people, this is where they grab hold of celebrating the Shabbat and the circumcision. Those were outward things that would would help them be identifiable when they're in exile, having been lost to the nations. So identity and naming was very important in the ancient world. So we see Adam naming animals. It was bringing them into existence. So gaining a name or losing a name was, losing a name, was like losing reputation, was like losing yourself. There was like
Mm.
what they talk today about. So for example, if you're in China and they were going to arrest you, what they would do, they call it they would disappear you, and they would remove your name and everything about you from the internet and from your like you would just lose your existence. So it's kind of the same
Wow.
thing.
I've heard of archaeologists when they're going back and they're looking in caverns and things, and when a dynasty is switched over to the next dynasty, and there would be, actually, it would be more like a ruler takes over.
Mhm.
Like, then they would be eliminating the pictures that were on the walls to eliminate the history of the previous
Exactly.
ruler.
Yeah. Well, so we do the same thing today. right? I mean, we're in the process, the left is in the process of eliminating our history on purpose by design. Why? To eliminate any vestige of God in, in the universe.
Right.
Because, and we see the contradiction between God creating, bringing two together and bringing forth life. And then you see that the nature of the other side is death. And
Right.
so in that everything they're doing is to destroy the image of God in this world. Well, the image of God in this world is we, the people. We are his
Right.
image. And so the only way people know, and not the only way, but you understand the way people understand that God is real and he exists and works through a human agency is because of us and what he's done in our lives. So you take, you eliminate, you destroy Christianity, the faith community. I mean, that's the goal. The reason is to remove God and his image and replace it with themselves is essentially what we're dealing with here.
Don't you see that as another reason why it's so very, very important that we honor the Sabbath, that we honor the Shabbat,
Amen.
that we be those people that refuse to let that go. We refuse to not, and it and in every home that there's a light in every home, but not just on the Shabbat, throughout the week, because it's not just that 24-hour period. It is that 24-hour period, but it's in every one of our lives. That's why it's so valuable and so important that we each have our testimony, that we each speak life when we're out in public. I mean, we're the kings.
Yeah.
We're the priests. We're the
That is exactly right. So
between heaven and earth, bringing it
yeah.
together, right? That's what our responsibility and our job is here.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Well, no, I was just, my mind's just
No, go.
sparking. But when we see Yeshua, where is, I mean, yes, he's crucified and the historical background accurate. I'm not arguing that, but the sort of greater message there, Yeshua hanging on a tree, which is very interesting, as I told you about trees and kings, and the trunk of the tree representing the divine essence of the king. But what did he do when he hung on the tree? Is in essence, he brought together the unity between heaven and earth on the tree
Yes.
by humbling himself, and willingly going, to be crucified in the most vile way possible. But he brought those two spheres together and as one unity so that his people would produce life. And so, not just life, physical life, but obviously the life to plant that seed, the seed that came from the creation week all the way. So they would plant the seed all over planet Earth so that it would bear fruit. And I think that's as that seed bears fruit all over the earth, comes up forth from the earth, is how his sovereign empire is extended. But it is always been and always will be through us. We have to remember that. We are his priests, his ambassadors, his kings on this earth by design. So
Agreed. That's beautiful. Woo. That's I'm just it's rolling over me right now.
let me just say something, because
Yeah.
that's an important point you made about the Sabbath. That's our identifiable feature. When Israel, when the southern tribe went into exile in Babylon, uh, different from Assyria because they kept themselves kind of together. The Assyrians, one of the things they always did was they would take families and separate them off into different, so there was no ability for them to join together. But the Babylonians didn't do that. And so they, within the Babylonian community, they were able to build up and keep their identity, if you will, in no small measure. And of course, they ended up doing quite well in Babylon, and as they worked and planted, built houses and planted gardens and stuff, they extended. And I just forgot the point I was going to make. Oh, okay, yeah. So they kept
Shabbat.
themselves, yeah, identifiable, with the Shabbat. So when we go through the creation week, remember we're talking about house building, dynasty building, temple building. And so we go through the process of building, and then the building is finished. So now when you finish building something, you don't just leave it standing there and walk away. You're now going to move in and fill it with your stuff, hang your paintings, and put in your furniture and do all that. So God in essence is doing the same thing. He's moving into the cosmos and taking his seat. And what we describe as the Sabbath, or in the seventh day rest, in the ancient world, for them, that meant that the king had been enthroned. So on the seventh day in the creation week, the king is enthroned. And what his enthronement also meant was that he had defeated all the enemies, that would come against the people to try to destroy them, or to take out the king and install their own, invading armies install their own king. But now the king had defeated all those enemies. So rest is more or less equated with defeating enemies and taking the throne. And so that's our message, on the seventh. Obviously it should be every day, but on this day we're reminded that he has defeated our enemies. I mean, Paul talks about this a lot, and we kind of forget that he has won the victory, has defeated those enemies. And this
Right.
is the day in which we are in essence a rehearsal, for him. He's on the throne. Rest has come, and all that goes in, and so all the prayers, all the liturgy. I mean, you don't find any Jewish prayer that doesn't say something about, "O Lord, our God, King of the universe." Okay, every Jewish prayer pretty much has these elements of kingship and God ruling over the heavens and the earth.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Um, I wanted to, there was a point I wanted to ask you about with the Shabbat. Oh, I know. You were talking about that the king is ruling and reigning in the Shabbat, and the rest is that's what he's doing, that he's in that place. There's the war's not happening,
Right,
that he's
right.
in his place.
Rest.
I
Yeah,
also remember you said something about how when everything is completed, the 6 days, they're completed, they're functioning the way that they need to be functioning. The the work is it's not perfected in the sense that it's going to stop, because we have a
right,
weird thought of the word perfect, but that it is functioning properly, and so each day is building on the next, building on the next, building on the next. So by the seventh day, it's not that everything stops, it's
right.
that everything is functioning
Yeah.
properly.
So now it's time. The kingdom can operate and fully function because the king is on the throne.
Mm,
You don't have an operating empire if there's no king.
right.
Right? It's not functioning. So that is the point as we go through. So there's two different kinds of work. The first 6 days they use the Hebrew word melacha, and on the seventh day is a different kind of work. The Hebrew word avad or avodah,
Avodah.
service, and that's the word that's generally connected to cultivating in the garden, but service in the temple is all considered to be avodah. So really the major work day in the temple was actually the Sabbath. That's when they did all the work. I mean, they cleaned the altar on the Sabbath. Okay. Not
Right.
every.
That was one of those things that never made sense that I couldn't ask about.
Yeah. So
It's like,
it's a very busy day
it's a
in the
busy
temple
day.
complex. And
Yeah.
so we have this idea like that the rest somehow means that we don't do anything. But it's precisely the opposite. And I don't mean, going out shopping, you understand what I'm saying,
Right.
but
Exactly.
it
Stay
is
focused.
a day to perform service for those who are less fortunate, or those in
Right.
need, or whatever. Yeshua, he even brought that up, because the
Mhm.
concept of rest is our king is on the throne and the kingdom is functioning as it's supposed to be functioning.
That is so beautiful. That right there, Dr. Dye, that's just it's life-giving, and it's stirring things up within me that are it's starting to make sense. Things are starting to pull together
Yeah.
a little bit more
Well,
about
hopefully
the
this is
Sabbath
the big
rest.
picture. And
Yeah.
so now as you're reading the scriptures, the hope is that if you see the big design, then when you're reading the stories, you can see this sort of this push again to build a house for the presence of God, to make sure that he's seated on the throne. And then there's basically only two camps in all this. You either have the rulers of this world or Yahweh ruling over. There's no
Mhm.
middle ground. I think we're seeing that pretty clearly now.
Mhm.
And so the
Yeah.
question is, who are you giving your allegiance to? What kingdom are you dwelling in? And every king has requirements and obligations to be met to be in his kingdom. And we see, we go through all the kings of Israel, from basically from David to Zedekiah. We got good kings, bad kings, and we got some really bad kings. And this is all dealing with covenant breaking language, so that when the king breaks covenant with Yahweh, it ain't good for the folks. And when the king restores that covenant, then the blessing comes. So it matters who your king is.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think a lot of us, when we're reading the history in the Bible, we're reading the history because we don't understand kingship or the value of kingship. When we're reading that, uh, well, I'll just say for me, you're not so emotionally invested in if it's a good king or if it's a bad king.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, no. Yeah.
And so you're reading it like, yeah, okay, he was a rotten king.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what we don't understand is that the destruction
Exactly.
for the heirs, for the seeds that are to come, the
Yes.
destruction that is being um, put forth into the generations to
Yeah.
come, and then we have to start the redemption
Yeah.
work has to come back and over, and that's why the Holy One says that he's going to visit the generations, 7 generations. He's going to keep visiting, keep
Yes.
visiting, keep
Yes.
visiting, and deal with those issues. But we don't really see it. We don't really see so much the value, or we haven't seen so much the value of kingship. And I'm really trusting that this is the time in the world that we're in today, that this is the time that we will have a fresh awakening of the
Yes.
kingship of the
Mhm.
Holy One, because it will change the way that we perceive everything in our lives.
I agree 100%.
Yeah,
So
right.
I look
And
at, of course, now remember, David could not build a temple because he was a man of war. So his job was to get rid of all the enemies, right? The king can't take the throne until all the
yeah,
enemies are gone. So that
right.
was David's responsibility. And then his son Solomon comes to the throne. And, Solomon's got some issues.
He's got some women issues.
Yeah, and actually, well, I'm actually tackling this in my new book
Are
on
you?
the Temple Revealed Noah's Ark. I think
Wow.
some of it's a bad rap, but
You
over and
think?
above, he wasn't to intermarry with the Moabites and the Canaanites and
Right,
all the ites.
right.
And but it talks about a king isn't to multiply wives, it's not to multiply silver and gold and multiply horses, which of course he did exactly the opposite, you
Right,
know, in every way.
right, right.
And he was Solomon I mean, he accumulated great power, but he ended up basically being an arms dealer. He was like the number one arms dealer in the ancient world at that time,
Wow.
buying and selling. And what would happen is that the arms that other nations would buy would be used against his own nation.
Mm,
Yeah, that's fairly typical, right? So
mhm.
there were a lot of things that he did, and he incorporated slave labor to
Mm,
build. And I got a whole other thing on slavery, but slave labor to build the temple, right? Foreign slave and the people of Israel. He
mm.
there's kind of a revisiting Egypt thing, Pharaoh, going on
Yes.
here with Solomon. So I suggest in my book that the downfall of Judah really began with Solomon, because who's the next in line? Who's his seed that's going to take the throne was Rehoboam. You remember? But after Solomon, the kingdom split. That was the first devastation. The United Monarchy split, and Rehoboam's ruling over the southern tribes and Jeroboam over the northern tribes. And then we go down, and we got some good and bad kings, and Hezekiah being one of the better kings. But even he allowed the king of he allowed one of his guys to go to Damascus and get the blueprints for an altar. Oh no, that was his father. Ahaz got the blueprints for the altar and brought that blueprint back, and they built an altar, a replica of that altar in front of the other altar. So that was his father Ahaz, and then Hezekiah came in and kind of restored things, but then it went, south after his son Manasseh. But you go through this whole story, and then you come to the end, and the Babylonians. But there was something that Hezekiah did that kind of put the nail in the coffin, if you will, and that is he invited the envoys of Babylon to come into the temple precincts and into the temple building itself, and he showed him all the gold and silver. Like, you don't bring the enemy into the camp and show them your wealth, right? Not a good.
Oh, gee.
So and that wealth had originally come from Solomon. So Solomon, I think, the fruit of his rule is the splitting of the kingdom and the final exile of the children of Israel. It's not like they didn't disobey all the way along the line, but
Mhm.
but God was not going to be mocked, and he dealt with the line, and then they eventually, disappeared into Babylon. And of course, they did start returning after 70 years, because God, his promises, the promise to the people that is he would restore the Davidic dynasty. That was the promise. And of course, we see that manifested in Yeshua.
Yes, we do. So beautiful. We have just a couple minutes
Oh,
left here.
wow.
I know. Did that go so fast? I have like 47 more questions for you. But I was wondering if you have time, we would love to have an after party with you and have people be able to ask you questions. Would you be up for a little bit of
Oh, yeah.
time? How much time would you have? I mean, I don't want to,
What do you usually do?
yeah, we usually hang out for about half an hour.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Um, I just want to uh, kind of go just say over blah, blah, blah. I can't cut that out. I don't have that power. But what I wanted to say was, please go on to Dr. Dai's webpage, foundationsintorah.com. She has amazing information there. She has a great YouTube channel. She has lots and lots of teaching there. I just recently watched a series that you did with Dr. Brad Scott. It was fantastic. It was so informative and such a blessing. So I would really recommend that for you, if you want, for anyone who wants to just jump on and get some more information. Her books are available, and you can get those at Foundations in Torah.
Well, the books right now, the two books, Temple Revealed in the Garden and Creation,
Mhm.
are on Amazon. So
Oh, they're
yeah,
okay.
I don't actually. I'm in the process. I ran out at home, but Amazon
Okay.
prints on demand, so and they're on sale, so you can easily get them there. Yeah,
Okay.
Brad and I had decided, because he wrote a book about the tabernacle, and I said, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
And not a lot of the teachers get together and do sort of that kind of interaction. So we really
I love
had a
that.
great time and kind of bounced off of one another, and
Yeah.
both of us, had different information, but enough information to be able. So we did a 12-part series, and it is free on the website. You just need to sign up on the website, though. You can become a free member, but you'll have access to that series.
Wow. It's so worth watching.
That was
My
fun.
yeah, my
I,
husband and I spent the evenings binge watching that.
oh,
It's good binge watching TV, guys.
there you go.
It's very good. Well, thank you so much for being with us, and for those of you who are listening by podcast, thank you so much for being part of this Tuesday talk with Dr. Dai today. And we just pray blessings and shalom over you, and we will see you next Tuesday on Tuesday Talk.